The face on the monitor looked like it had been carved out of sleepless nights and unspoken regrets. Lines cut deep across skin I had once known as strong and unshakable. His eyes darted from one unseen person to another, the way a man does when he's surrounded but still trying to calculate his way out. It was my father. Around me, the air in the U.S. Army Cyber Command Operations Center at Fort Bragg was heavy with the low hum of servers, a chorus of keystrokes, and the almost tangible tension that clings to classified situations. The glow of monitors painted everything in shades of blue and white. To my right stood Major General Lance Miller, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that never needed to be announced. He leaned toward me, speaking low enough that only I could hear. "Major, the asset is compromised. The FBI's been locked out. Protocol blackout is our only option, but," he paused, measuring the words, "there's a significant risk of total data loss to the civilian entity." My eyes flicked back to the video feed. My father's image was grainy, but I knew that look. It was the same one I'd seen years ago when his plans started slipping beyond his control, except back then, I was just a kid on the sidelines. Now, the decision was mine. General Miller's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "It's your op, Falcon. Your call." Falcon. That was my call sign, the name I'd earned in a dozen missions where hesitation wasn't an option. My real name is Major Megan Carter, U.S. Army, Cyber Warfare Division. I'd been in plenty of tense situations before, but never with a feed like this in front of me, the man who raised me, who'd spent most of my life doubting my career choices, now staring down a disaster only I could contain. I studied him for a long moment. The years had softened his hair to steel grey and etched deeper lines in the corners of his mouth, but the air of command was still there, or at least the remnants of it. Even now, even with his company teetering on the edge of collapse, he still tried to look like he was in control. Something cold and sharp slid into place inside me. The noise of the room, the clicking keys, the low murmurs, the soft whir of cooling fans, faded until all I could hear was the steady beat of my own heart. My training taught me to weigh risks, calculate probabilities, and choose the path that preserved the mission above all else. I gave a single, crisp nod. "Authorize it, General." That was all. No speeches, no hesitation. My voice was steady, the same way it had been when I'd given orders during live cyber engagements against hostile foreign actors. The general didn't question it. He just turned and began issuing commands to the rest of the team. As the operation kicked into motion around me, the screens began to fill with cascading lines of code and tactical readouts. Analysts moved into position like chess pieces sliding into their roles. The room shifted into that particular kind of controlled chaos, one where every movement was measured, every instruction precise. But my eyes stayed on that frozen image of my father on the primary screen, the one the feed had locked on after the breach. He didn't know I was here. He didn't know I was the one holding the decision that could either save his company's data or wipe it completely from existence. Just 24 hours earlier, the day had been bright and humid, the summer air thick with the scent of cut grass and barbecue smoke. There had been no screens, no encrypted transmissions, no national security protocols. Only family. Only the kind of battlefield where the wounds weren't physical but just as lasting. He had no idea that the chain of events set into motion yesterday, with a single sentence from his lips, had led directly to this moment. And he definitely didn't know that the person he dismissed was about to determine the fate of everything he'd spent his life building. 24 hours earlier, the only glow on my face came from North Carolina sunshine, not the cold light of classified monitors. I'd driven 3 hours down I-95 from Fort Bragg with the windows cracked, letting pine air push the fatigue out of my bones. My dress blues stayed on the hanger in the back seat. I wore a simple polo and khakis, hoping, naively, that neutral would mean safe. Father's Day in the suburbs shouldn't have felt like an insertion into hostile terrain, but my pulse told the truth my mind refused to admit. The Carters' backyard spread out like an advertisement for contentment. String lights, a new cedar deck, a smoker humming low, kids darting between lawn chairs with sparklers they weren't supposed to have at noon. My brother, Chris, stood at the grill with that relaxed CEO posture he'd perfected, one hand on a pair of tongs, the other cradling a craft beer he could name down to the yeast. A banner strung over the fence read a family legacy in bold blue letters, part of my sister-in-law's new obsession with curated celebrations. Meg. Mom, Linder, swept me into a hug that smelled like sunscreen and lemon bars. She was still the diplomat, smoothing edges no one else noticed. You made it. Wouldn't miss it, I said, handing over a bouquet I'd grabbed at a highway market. She slipped it into a mason jar as if it mattered. Dad, Richard Carter, looked up from a cluster of neighbors and former soldiers who always seemed to materialize when he hosted. His hair had settled into its permanent steel grey, his posture still regulation proud even after retirement. He lifted his glass. To my son, he announced, voice carrying like a parade ground command. To Chris Carter, who builds something you can see, touch, and drive past with pride. Applause rolled across the lawn. Someone whistled. Chris ducked his head with rehearsed humility. My father's smile sharpened when his eyes landed on me. And Megan's here, he added, a beat too late. A ripple of polite laughter. Good to see you taking a break from your computer work. I felt it, that familiar slip under my feet, as if the grass tilted toward a cliff only I could see. Mom squeezed my wrist. The gesture said, let it go. For the moment, I did. Chris passed me a plate. Burgers, Lieutenant, he teased. Major, I corrected, easy as breathing. He held up a hand. My mistake. Then to Dad, loud enough for the circle to hear, you know Meg, she's the ninja who can shut down an entire city with a keyboard. They laughed again, the kind of laughter that doesn't mean harm and still leaves bruises. I found a quiet corner near the hydrangeas and watched the choreography of my family. Dad moved from group to group like a commander inspecting his line, every conversation orbiting the house Chris renovated. The new headquarters Carter and Sons was opening, the municipal contracts in the pipeline. My accomplishments lived in rooms with no windows, couldn't be photographed or toasted with champagne. You can't hang a classified citation over a mantle. Dad's shadow fell across the grass before he reached me. Walk with me, he said, not a suggestion. We took the path along the fence, past the shed Chris had turned into a kids' art studio. When we were in the narrow slice of shade where voices from the deck blurred, he stopped. You know, seeing you like this, he began, eyes on the roofline Chris had reinforced, it reminds me what you didn't choose. I kept my hands in my pockets. What I did choose works for me. For you, he echoed. But legacy isn't personal, Megan. It's visible. It stands after you're gone. His jaw tightened. Chris carries the name forward. He builds. Men put on hard hats because of him. That matters. So does keeping the grit up, I said, evenly. He nodded as if humoring a child. I'm not dismissing your contribution. But this is Father's Day. For fathers and their legacies. He finally looked at me, and the blue of his eyes was the same blue I'd looked up at from a little league bleacher, waiting for approval that never arrived. I don't think you should stay. It's for the best. No raised voice. No scene. Just a quiet eviction stamped with paternal authority. For an instant, the world narrowed to the sound of a neighbor's wind chimes and the faint sizzle from the grill. I could have argued. I could have listed operations and outcomes he'd never be cleared to hear. Instead, I swallowed the words, nodded once, and set my plate on the edge of a planter. Mum must have read the angle of our bodies from across the yard because she intercepted me at the side gate. Honey. It's fine, I said. It wasn't. Tell Chris the burgers were good. Her mouth compressed. Your father. His old school. Concrete over code. I know, I said, stepping onto the driveway heat. He'll learn. The car door thunked shut with the satisfying finality of a vault. I sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, watching sunlight flash on the upstairs windows. Behind one, Dad's war medals hung in a frame. Below, on the mantel, Chris's latest framed article in a regional business magazine. No place left for anything invisible. Back on the highway, the miles unwound. I let anger burn clean and then settle into something colder, an order of operations even my father would respect. Mission. Protocol. Outcome. By the time the green signs for Fort Bragg appeared, the decision tree in my head was quiet. If he wanted legacy he could see, he just made sure I'd be the one to determine whether he ever saw it again. I parked outside the SCIF and stared at my reflection in the dark glass. My face looked the way it always did after a long run, focused, unsentimental. I swiped my badge, entered the airlock, and stepped into the familiar blue light. The room welcomed me like a truth serum. Evening, Major, a specialist Kim called from the monitoring bay. You're early. Or late, I said. Depends what's coming. I hung my civilian clothes in my locker, slid into my uniform, and tied my hair with the precision of habit. The weight of the name tape over my heart steadied me, Carter. Funny how the same name could feel like a wall at noon and a shield at night. I took my station, brought up the dashboards, and let the river of data pour through me. Somewhere out there, Dad was raising his glass, Chris was carving the first slice of brisket, and a dozen voices were saying what a gift it was to have a legacy you could point at from the street. In here, my battlefield waited, quiet, lit by code, vigilant as a heartbeat. I didn't know yet that the first ripple was already moving, that by morning an alert banner would paint the wall the color of alarm, carrying the name that had just banished me from a backyard. But I felt it anyway, the way animals feel storms before the clouds gather, a pressure change, a falling barometer inside the chest. I straightened, hands on the keyboard, and let the calm roll over me like a tide. If legacy had to be visible, then mine would arrive as light, cold, undeniable, and inescapable. Back at Fort Bragg, the barracks are felt cleaner than any summer breeze I'd left behind. Civilian life always carried its own kind of static for me, unspoken hierarchies, cliques, invisible scorecodes where people like my father assigned value to a visible careers. But the second I stepped into the SCIF, that all fell away. The sensitive compartmented information facility was a world without windows, sealed behind biometric scans and soundproof doors. The lighting was a sterile blue-white that washed every shadow away. Screens lined the walls in overlapping grids of network maps, encrypted comms feeds, and live telemetry from across the globe. Inside here, no one cared about family barbecues or who had a bigger house. Here, results were currency, and mine had kept a lot of people's lights on, literally. Major Carter, you're on rotation for incident response today, a specialist Kim called from her station, eyes never leaving her monitor. Copy that, I answered, sliding into my chair. My workstation lit up with my access credentials, the world's most dangerous game boards unfolding in front of me, traffic logs from critical infrastructure, real-time alerts, and deep scans on hostile network activity. I wore my call sign like armor. Falcon. Here, no one called me a major misstep, a nickname my father had once tossed out at Christmas after learning I'd won the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. He'd laughed like it was harmless humor, but it had been a dismissal wrapped in a joke. Not a real soldier, just plays at war from behind a desk. What he didn't understand, or maybe refused to, was that my desk was a frontline position in the only battles that never sleep. I thought back to last winter, when my team had intercepted a zero-day exploit aimed at the eastern seaboard power grid. We traced it to a state-sponsored group that had already taken down half a dozen smaller networks in Europe. The mitigation window had been less than 2 hours. I'd coordinated the response like a conductor at a symphony: kill chain protocols, server isolations, reverse payloads. The attack never made the news, which meant we'd done our job perfectly. My CO, General Miller, had given me nothing more than a curt nod afterward. From him, that was as good as a medal. That was the beauty of this world. Praise wasn't about sentiment. It was about trust. If they trusted you with the mission, they didn't need to decorate you with applause. Still, there was a constant disconnect when I crossed back into my family's orbit. The gulf between the person I was here and the person they thought I was out there kept widening. I'd long since stopped trying to translate one world into the language of the other. Until the day came when the two worlds collided. It started at 0900, halfway through a code review. My terminal pinged with a Tier 1 alert, priority level reserved for existential threats to major infrastructure. The system auto-prioritized based on severity, ransomware with confirmed active deployment. I leaned forward, scanning the incident brief. The victim's network was fully encrypted, every endpoint locked. No recovery path without the decryption key. I scrolled down to the asset ID, and my fingers froze above the keys. Carter and Sons Construction Incorporated. The company my brother ran. The company my father treated like a living monument to our family name. The company I'd been told, in no uncertain terms, I had nothing to do with and no claim to. The stillness that came over me wasn't satisfaction. It was clarity, the way a complex equation suddenly collapses into a single elegant solution. I knew exactly how this was going to play out. Before I could dwell on it, my phone, set to silent, vibrated against the desk, rattling in place. I flipped it over. Missed call count, 18. Then 27. By the time I'd read the number again, it had jumped to 43. All from the same two names, Dad and Chris. I powered the phone off and set it face down. This wasn't revenge. This was protocol. By 1400 hours, the attack had escalated exactly as the incident report predicted. The ransomware strain was polymorphic, adapting every time one of our automated defenses tried to analyze it. That alone told me the origin wasn't some basement hacker. This was nation-state grade, a signature I'd seen before in classified threat group dossiers. Per federal protocol, Once a hostile cyber operation touched private infrastructure with potential national security implications, the FBI handed the case over to the Department of Defense. That meant one thing: the request would land on the desk of the lead analyst for that threat sector. My desk. At 14:17, the secure door to my workstation clicked open and Major General Miller stepped in without knocking. He carried a tablet under one arm, his face unreadable. "Major," he said, tone low and deliberate, "the FBI has formally requested our intervention in the Carter and Sons incident." I held his gaze. "I know the name." "I figured you might," he replied, setting the tablet down between us. "This puts you in a compromised position, personal connection to the target. I can reassign if necessary." "Sir, with respect, no one on this floor has more experience with this threat actor. The mission comes first." His eyes narrowed slightly, weighing my words. "Then your operational lead. Your call sign's in command now. I'll handle the chain of authority. You handle the op." "Yes, sir." The general tapped the screen. "We've scheduled a secure VTC with Carter and Sons and their FBI liaison in 30 minutes. You'll brief after I set the stage." When he left, I stood for a moment in the quiet hum of the servers. I knew what was about to happen. The 72 missed calls that would pile up on my powered-down phone weren't apologies. They were panicked orders for the IT girl and the family to drop everything and fix it. They had no idea they were already in my AO, subject to my protocols, my risk assessments, my decision tree. At precisely 1,500 hours, the secure video link engaged with a soft digital chime. The wall display lit up with the Carter and Sons executive boardroom. I'd been there before, once, years ago, when Chris had invited me to a family tour that turned into a 2-hour slideshow about projected revenue streams. Now the same polished table was covered in printouts, empty coffee cups, and the kind of body language that reads like a storm warning. Chris was slumped in a chair, tie loosened, pale under the fluorescent lights. My father sat at the head of the table, posture more rigid than I'd seen in years, but his face had collapsed into something smaller, sharper, like a man who'd woken to find the ground gone under his feet. Beside them sat a stone-faced FBI liaison, flipping through a briefing folder. General Miller took his seat in our command center with the emblem of US Cyber Command perfectly centered behind him. On the other end, the FBI agent cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," the liaison began, "as we've explained, the complexity of this attack exceeds our current domestic capabilities. Jurisdiction has been transferred to the Department of Defense. You are now under their operational command for the duration of the incident." My father straightened, forcing a nod in what I recognized as his equal-to-equal posture. "Whatever it takes, General," he said, his voice pitched to sound cooperative. "My company and all its resources are at your service." The irony almost made me smile. His resources were digital rubble, and he was deep in a battle space he didn't understand. General Miller didn't return the smile. "Your point of contact for this operation," he said, "is our lead analyst on this threat actor, foremost expert in neutralizing their infrastructure." He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "I'll turn the brief over to her now." I stepped forward into camera view, my class a uniform immaculate, silver oak leaf insignia gleaming under the LED lights. I sat with deliberate precision, eyes locked on the feed. The change on their faces was immediate. Chris's mouth fell open. My father's color drained as if someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, no sound. This was the man who'd had a quip ready for every accomplishment of mine, who'd never let a moment pass without reminding me where I'd have fallen short. Now he couldn't find a single word. I let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of statement. "Mr. Carter," I began, my voice stripped of anything personal. "I am Major Megan Carter. Call sign Falcon. My team has isolated the malware. We have one tactical option, counter-protocol code name Blackout." I paused to make sure the weight landed. 60% chance we restore your systems. 40% chance we trigger a total, irreversible data wipe. I leaned forward slightly. "The legacy you've spent your life building will either be saved or erased in the next 5 minutes. We require your formal authorization to proceed." For the first time in my life, my father heard the chain of command from the wrong end. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking just enough to betray him. "Authorize it." I didn't look at him again. I turned to my team. "Execute protocol Blackout." The hum in the SCIF rose as commands cascaded through secure lines. I stood, already finished with the personal war. Whether the company lived or died was just an operational outcome now. And for the first time, he understood exactly how small his authority was in my world. Didn't stay to watch the execution of the Blackout protocol. The outcome, whether the Carter and Son servers blinked back to life or dissolved into digital dust, was for the after-action report, not for me. My war was over the moment my father spoke those 2 words in front of witnesses, the moment he yielded control to a daughter he'd never truly recognized as a commander. The SCIF door shut behind me with a soft hydraulic hiss. The corridor outside was quiet, lined with sealed compartments and red-lit access points. I walked it without hurry, feeling the strange calm that follows a completed mission, when your body's still primed for battle, but your mind knows the fight's done. In the officer's lounge, the TV was tuned to muted news, the captions crawling under images of storm damage in the Midwest. Nobody here knew that, a few dozen yards away, I'd just run point on an operation that could erase a multi-million-dollar company from existence. That was the nature of our work. The biggest moments stayed invisible to everyone outside the loop. 6 months later, the next chapter of my career came with a change of rank. The auditorium at Fort Bragg was filled with dress uniforms and polished brass, the air heavy with floor wax and formality. I stood at attention while Major General Miller pinned the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel to my shoulders. His voice, low enough for only me to hear, carried the rare edge of genuine respect. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," he said, "your detached, professional handling of the Carter and Sons incident is already being used as a case study at the War College. You set the standard for putting mission above personal stakes." He stepped back, giving me one of those faint, almost imperceptible smiles. "Congratulations, Falcon." There was no awkward family reception afterward. No half-sincere toasts, no sidelong glances over glasses of bourbon. My people, the analysts, operators, and engineers who'd been in the trenches with me, formed a noisy huddle around me, clapping my back, laughing, swapping fragments of inside jokes from ops we couldn't talk about outside the wire. This was my family. Not bound by blood, but by trust. Not linked by last names, but by shared competence when the stakes were highest. In that circle, there was no measuring my worth against someone else's scoreboard. No one asked how many houses I'd built or how many magazine covers I'd appeared on. They cared about whether I'd hold the line when it mattered. And I always had. Weeks passed before my father reached out in any form. It came through an email to my official inbox, something he'd never used before. The sender line read, Richard Carter. Subject, Father's Day. The body was short. It's next week. I would be honored if you would be welcome. No mention of the operation. No reference to the secure feed where I'd laid out the odds of his company's survival like a clinical diagnosis. Just those two words. Honored, welcome, offered years too late. I stared at the message for a long moment. Once, I would have printed it out, folded it into a book, carried it like proof that someday he'd see me. Now, it was just a digital artifact from a part of my life I no longer needed to prove. I moved the email into my archive folder. Not deleted, just preserved as history. The truth was simple. My peace was no longer something he could grant or withhold. It was built into the walls of my world, forged from 1,000 quiet victories he would never know about. My office overlooked the sprawling grids of Fort Bragg, the geometry of training fields and motor pools stretching to the tree line. The window was open just enough to let in the smell of cut grass and hot asphalt. On my desk sat a stack of after-action reports from operations I couldn't even reference in polite company. Each one represented weeks of planning, minutes of execution, and years of skill honed in the shadows. That was my legacy, not a building you could point at, but a network of lives and missions kept safe because I'd been there when it counted. And if my father had finally learned how to welcome me, it didn't matter. I'd built a world where his invitation wasn't required. A legacy, I realized, isn't something you inherit. It's authority earned in the moments no one else is watching, when the decision is yours alone, and you choose the mission anyway. The weeks after my promotion rolled into a new rhythm. My new office in the operations wing was twice the size of the one I'd had before, with a window that looked out over the runways and training grounds. The view stretched far enough that, on clear days, I could see the shimmer of the Cape Fear River beyond the tree line. Every morning, I arrived before the first coffee pots had finished brewing in the break room. Not because I had to, but because I liked the stillness before the day's traffic of operators, analysts, and visiting brass filled the corridors. The hum of the servers in the SCIF was constant, almost like a heartbeat, and it steadied me more than any speech or ceremony ever had. On my desk sat two photographs, one of my unit during a rare off-duty barbecue on base, the other of my mother when she was my age, smiling at something outside the frame. There was no picture of my father. It wasn't an intentional omission. It was simply the truth of what my workspace needed to hold. By then, Carter & Sons had recovered from the ransomware attack, at least operationally. From what I'd heard through indirect channels, they'd had to liquidate several projects to fund the rebuild, and their client list had taken a hit. But they'd survived, and survival in my line of work was its own kind of victory. Whether my father considered it one was irrelevant. I kept expecting some follow-up from him after the Father's Day email. Another attempt, maybe clumsy, to bridge the canyon between us. But none came. And that silence, strangely enough, was better. It meant he'd accepted that I wasn't waiting on him anymore. One afternoon, while reviewing a complex intrusion simulation with my team, I caught myself thinking back to the moment on the secure feed, the look on his face when I stepped into the camera's frame. It wasn't triumph I felt remembering it. It was recognition of something colder, cleaner, the moment when the power dynamic between us had shifted permanently. He'd spent my entire life trying to measure me against a standard I'd never agreed to, when he valued because it mirrored his own. But the battlefield had changed, and the chain of command no longer ran through him. The War College report on the Carter & Sons operation came across my desk in draft form a few weeks later. It described, in clinical, declassified language, how the incident had been managed, risk assessed, mitigation executed, and personal conflict navigated without compromising mission integrity. My name appeared only in the personnel list and the operational timeline. The rest was about decisions, outcomes, and lessons learned. That was enough. I didn't need my story told in their voice. I'd already lived it in mine. Late in August, I received an invitation to speak at a closed-session panel on a leadership under compromised conditions. It was the kind of professional recognition that mattered in my field. Quiet, invitation only, attended by the people whose opinions carried weight in real decisions. I accepted without hesitation. When I stepped onto that stage, looking out over a room filled with uniforms and civilian suits alike, I felt no trace of the nervous girl who'd once stood in her father's backyard being told she didn't belong. I spoke for 40 minutes about protocol, adaptability, and the necessity of emotional detachment when the mission involved personal stakes. I didn't name Carter and Sons. I didn't need to. The people who mattered knew exactly which op I was talking about, and the rest understood the principles. Afterward, a colonel from another branch approached me, her expression sharp with curiosity. "Falcon," as she said quietly, "you ever think about taking a command slot outside cyber?" I smiled. In this war, I already command a battlefield that never sleeps. I'm right where I need to be. That night, back in my apartment just off base, I sat by the window with a mug of tea, watching the headlights on the distant highway. My phone buzzed once. A text from Mom. "Hope you're well. Proud of you." No mention of Dad. No need. The quiet victory was this: I had reached a place where acknowledgement, if it came, was welcome but not required. Where the weight of my rank and my work came from the people who'd seen me under fire, not from a man who once measured worth in bricks and mortar. And somewhere out there, my father knew it too. That was enough. I stared at it for a full minute, the cursor blinking like it was tapping its foot. My father had never been the read justice type. Every conversation came with an angle, a purpose, an expectation. For him to claim there was a no agenda, it was either a genuine shift or a poorly disguised attempt to reset the board. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I minimized the message, pulled up the day's intel briefs, and lost myself in network threat analyses. By the time I resurfaced from my work hours later, the idea of responding felt less urgent. That night, as I walked across the parking lot toward my car, the September air was warm enough to carry the smell of pine and distant rain. A few years ago, an email like that would have consumed me, each sentence dissected, each possibility replayed. Now, it felt like background noise, a low hum I could acknowledge without letting it drown out the rest of the world. 3 days later, I was called into a late afternoon strategy meeting. A new ransomware campaign, similar to the one that had hit Carter and Sons, was worming its way through small municipal systems in the Midwest. The incident was nowhere near the scale of what I'd handled before, but its pattern was disturbing enough to warrant my attention. We worked until well past 2,200 hours, mapping the infection chain, isolating the dropper code, and drafting mitigation protocols for the affected local governments. By the time I stepped out of the SCIF, my phone had a dozen notifications. Most were operational updates, but one stood out, a voicemail from my mother. "Megan," as she began, her voice softer than usual, "Your father's been different lately. I think he's trying. Maybe you could meet him halfway. Call me." I played it twice, listening not to her words but to the spaces between them. Mom had always been the bridge builder, the one who'd rather patch over a rift than admit the foundation was cracked beyond repair. I didn't call back. Not out of spite, but because some bridges aren't meant to carry traffic in both directions. 2 weeks later, I was on the tarmac at Pope Army Airfield, seeing off a detachment heading to a joint exercise overseas. The roar of engines, the smell of jet fuel, the salutes exchanged in quick, sharp motions. This was my language. These were my people. As I watched the aircraft taxi toward the runway, I thought of how my father had once told me that a real soldiers carried rifles and built things you could see. I smiled at the memory, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood the difference between his definition of service and mine. Service, to him, was legacy you could engrave on a plaque. Service, to me, was the mission you completed whether or not anyone knew your name. That evening, I finally replied to his email. Dad, I'm not in Raleigh often. If our paths cross, I'll let you know. Take care. No promises. No open door, but no slammed one either. It was the kind of response that left the choice, and the distance, in my control. When I hit send, I didn't feel the rush of power I once thought would come from setting the terms. I felt something better, the steady, even calm of someone who no longer needed to win. Because in the end, I already had. October came with cooler mornings and a light haze over the Fort Bragg training grounds. The change in season always brought a shift in energy, new rotations of troops arriving for exercises, different operations hitting the planning boards, and the quiet pressure of the year's end on the horizon. For me, it also brought a rare stretch of uninterrupted work. No family emails, no sidelong calls from Mom trying to translate Dad's moods, no sudden reminders of Raleigh. The silence was a relief. I spent my days immersed in threat analysis, moving between the SCIF and my office like a tide between two shores. In this world, progress was measured in systems hardened, vulnerabilities patched, attacks neutralized before they could become headlines. In my father's world, none of that counted unless it could be printed on a brochure or carved into a cornerstone. The distance between those worlds was now permanent and comfortable. One Friday afternoon, as I wrapped up a briefing for the Joint Task Force, I found myself lingering by the main observation deck. Below, soldiers moved across the grounds in synchronized drills, their formations precise and sharp. Watching them, I remembered the girl I'd been at 18, stepping onto this base for the first time, half terrified, half hungry for the discipline and purpose she'd only read about. Back then, I thought the army would make me into someone my father couldn't ignore. What I didn't realize was that it would also teach me how little his acknowledgement would matter once I built my own standard. The following week, I was invited to an off-record discussion with the visiting Defense Department Undersecretary. The conversation ranged from emerging cyber threats to leadership under pressure. At one point, he asked what had been the most difficult decision of my career. I thought briefly of overseas deployments, of sleepless nights tracing hostile code through servers across 3 continents, but the image that rose unbidden was my father's face on that secure feed, pale and wordless as I briefed him like any other civilian under my command. That one was personal, I said finally, but the mission didn't change. The Undersecretary nodded. The mark of a professional. Later that night, I drove out to the quiet perimeter road that skirted the base. The air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the trees. I parked and got out, leaning against the hood, staring up at the spread of stars. Out here, with no city lights to compete, the sky looked almost too large. I thought about legacy, how much of my life had been spent chasing someone else's definition of it. My father's version had always been something fixed in place, a building, a company, a tangible monument. But mine had become something fluid, something that lived in actions repeated over years, in trust earned without ceremony. In early November, Mom sent a photo. It was of the old Carter family mantle, now rearranged. The framed photo of Chris in front of his newest office building had been moved to one side. In its place was a smaller frame, my official army portrait in dress uniform. "Thought you'd like to see this," her text read. I stared at the photo for a long moment. It didn't stir what it might have years ago. No surge of triumph, no ache of long-denied approval. Just quiet acknowledgement that the pieces had shifted in their own way. I typed back, "Thanks, Mom." Nothing more. By Thanksgiving, the base was in its own kind of holiday mode, lighter schedules where possible, more off-duty gatherings in the Commons. I joined one in the lounge, sharing takeout with my team while we swapped stories from deployments and operations. The laughter was loud, the teasing merciless, and the camaraderie as easy as breathing. Looking around the table, I realized this was home. Not because it had to be, but because I chose it. And that choice, more than any rank or medal, was the true legacy I'd built. December settled over Fort Bragg with a sharp edge, the kind of cold that made the air feel clean. Mornings started in darkness now, the sun just beginning to lift when I crossed the parking lot toward the SCIF. The rhythm was the same: badge in, security checks, the hum of servers greeting me like a familiar voice, but the way I carried it felt different. One morning, standing at my office window with a mug of black coffee, I could see the whole sweep of the base. Beyond the parade field and hangars, the pine forest was silvered with frost. Soldiers moved in formation, their breath puffing white in the cold. Out past the airfield, the horizon glowed with the pale promise of daylight. It was the view I'd earned, every decision, every operation, every moment where I'd put the mission first was part of it. And unlike a building or a plaque, it couldn't be torn down or taken away. The final email from my father arrived mid-December. From Richard Carter. Subject: Merry Christmas. Body: hope you're doing well. We'd love to see you over the holidays. No pressure. I read it twice, then archived it with the others. No anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet understanding that the distance was permanent now, but it wasn't hostile. We lived in parallel lines, each moving forward in our own space. And for the first time, I realized I didn't want those lines to meet. 2 days before Christmas, I led my team through a live incident, an intrusion attempt on a classified research facilities network. It was fast, tense, and entirely impersonal. The kind of operation where your heart rate spikes and then drops the second the final firewall locks. Afterward, we stayed in the SCIF, ordering bad pizza and laughing at each other's attempts to name the new strain of malware. The camaraderie was effortless, untainted by old scorecodes or childhood rivalries. Looking around the room, I knew without question, this was my family. Not because we shared a last name, but because we shared the burden of the fight and the pride of winning it. On New Year's Eve, I chose not to go anywhere. No big party, no trip home. I stayed in my apartment, a quiet space filled with the things I'd chosen, books stacked on a low shelf, my mother's old quilt draped over the couch, a framed commendation from Cyber Command hanging by the door. At midnight, I stepped onto my balcony. The night was clear, the stars sharp. Somewhere beyond the base, fireworks burst in silent color, too far to hear. I breathed in the cold air and felt it settle inside me, not sharp, not biting, just steady. It struck me then, A legacy isn't the story people tell about you when you're gone. It's the authority you carry when no one's watching, the discipline to stand your ground when the choice is yours alone. Years ago, I'd thought I needed my father's seat at his table. I'd imagined that being a welcomed was the prize. But I'd built my own table, in a place where every chair was earned, not given out of obligation. And the view from here, over runways and training fields, over a horizon that didn't end, was better than anything I'd left behind.